Have you ever believed that the voices echoing through a church are the purest of all those who sing of heaven? Hope and salvation surely cannot fall, right? But the truth is far more painful. There are Sunday mornings when, stepping down from the pulpit, a pastor collapses in the vestry with a syringe still in his hand. There are performances that bring the whole congregation to tears. Yet at night, the very voice behind those tears quietly hides a packet of white powder behind a worn Bible. They are the gospel icons, souls torn apart, hidden behind sacred light. And in today's video, it's not just a list of the 23 greatest gospel artists, but a free-fall journey of people who once brought the world closer to God, yet couldn't save themselves. You'll be shocked, because one legend even died in a church restroom just from addiction. 23. Ray Charles, the blind genius and his battle with darkness in the light.
Oh woman, don't treat me so mean. You're the meanest old woman that I've ever seen.
Have you ever imagined that a musical genius like Ray Charles, who brought all of America to silence with his voice, once curled up on a bathroom floor, sweat pouring like rain, a trembling hand clutching a scorched metal spoon? Ray Charles was more than a soul music icon. He was the bridge between gospel and R&B, the first to blend the church's sighs with the rebellion of black music. From What Did I Say to Georgia on My Mind? He didn't just hit every emotion, he made a generation feel truly alive. But what few know is that before the stage lights found him, Ray wandered a dark path he nearly never escaped. On November 14, 1961, in a small Indianapolis hotel, police knocked on room 309. They didn't shout or force the door. Inside, Ray sat on the bed's edge, left hand holding a glass of cold water, right hand still trembling, as if every vein was in revolt. On the table lay a gray cloth bag filled with brown powder he called his dose of silence, alongside an empty syringe and a charred spoon. Ray didn't resist, didn't speak. His blind eyes saw nothing, but his face reflected a familiar fear, the fear of someone long ago bested by himself. He was 31 then, and it was his first official heroin arrest. No rumors this time, no secret backstage whispers. Ray Charles had to face the world. People asked why a genius like him spiraled so deeply, but they didn't live his childhood. They didn't witness his younger brother drowning in their backyard tub. They hadn't felt the silent void of blindness in a rejected world. In that utter isolation, he turned to white powder as comfort, turning it into a ritual before every show. When the music ended, only that powder remained with him in darkness. After that fateful night, Ray was sent to a rehab center in Los Angeles, the first nights. He curled in a blanket like a child, breathing as if every inhale was a battle. One day, a nurse found him crawling down the hall, tracing each brick as though looking for a lost soul. He didn't cry, he just softly whispered an old hymn, voice raspy, like it might break. No one joined him, only the wind howling through the window. It took nearly a year before he returned, but from that moment on, Ray no longer sang to conquer. He sang to survive, and when he gave voice to "I Don't Need No Doctor," people no longer heard brilliance. They heard a soul that once lost its way but still fought to come home. Etta James, a sob in a white dress. Some voices choke you the moment they begin. Etta James's was like that, husky, thick, trembling, but when she sang "I'd Rather Go Blind," the world seemed to hold its breath. She was called the heart of soul music, the restless spirit in a constant white dress. Yet beneath applause and dazzling lights, she wandered in ways no one expected. In June 1973, at the Hyatt Regency in Atlanta, staff knocked on room 714 after a cleaning attendant reported a strange smell. Inside, Etta lay on the bathroom floor, cheek pressed to cold tile, her hand gripping a broken syringe, faint signs of it on the floor. The sound of dripping water became a mournful refrain, blending with her fading breath. On a chair, the white dress she'd planned to wear to sign a new record deal hung wrinkled, stained with a faint red smudge. She'd finished recording her final demo that afternoon, but ended the day with heroin as if the spotlight had blinded her lost direction. She once wrote in her diary, "When I sing, I feel like a princess. But when the music stops, I'm just an orphan no one waits for." For the next 3 years, Etta spiraled through cycles of addiction and rehab from Minnesota to Oakland. Once, she lay motionless in a clinic for 2 days, merely breathing and singing hymns in her head, each word a patch holding her soul together. When she finally returned to the stage in her later years, the white dress still embraced her small frame. But the audience no longer heard glamour. They heard the fracture of a heart that had lived too long in darkness, saved only by music. James Cleveland, the gospel king and his sealed-off secret. No one enters a church to witness someone's breakdown, but sometimes those who sing loudest about faith are the quietest in their own screams. James Cleveland, born in Chicago in 1931, was the embodiment of faith in black music. He led America's most renowned choir and founded the GMWA, a place where thousands of black artists found voice and belonging. He was called the King of Gospel, but in the room behind the sanctuary, a different secret grew year by year. On the night of February 20th, 1978, after a heated meeting in Los Angeles where he was grilled over finances and scrutinized as if every decision were sinful, James drove home in darkness, in the suburban mansion. The living room still held large speakers and an electric organ lit by a red pilot light. He sank into an armchair, removed his silk jacket, and opened a small drawer in the coffee table. Inside lay a carefully folded piece of foil and an old, scratched credit card. He didn't sing, didn't pray, only heavy, ragged breathing, each inhalation sounding like flesh being burned from the inside. By sunrise, a housekeeper found him curled beside the organ, face pale, sweat soaked his shirt. A music score with blurred ink lay on the shelf, only one legible line: "If God won't forgive me, then who will?" James Cleveland passed away in 1991, taking his secrets with him. But that room that night, and his final written line, still make people wonder, did he ever live as himself, or was he always just the voice hiding a wounded soul? Cissy Houston, the sorrowful mother, and the burden of tragic legacy. No one would think that Cissy Houston, who stood beside Aretha Franklin and sang in packed Harlem churches in the 60s, could ever collapse at home. She stood as a symbol of strength and was the mother of Whitney Houston, the angelic voice that moved the world. Yet throughout her life, she watched her daughter slip into darkness and never return. Born in 1933, Cissy grew up surrounded by music and prayer. As a young woman, she was a beacon of faith and black strength, both an indispensable backup singer and the lead voice in the Sweet Inspirations. But singing couldn't shield her from tragedy, especially as her daughter's spotlight grew brighter and burned out faster. On the evening of August 3, 2008, in Newark, New Jersey, after a tearful argument with Whitney over her refusal to seek help, Cissy returned home to silence. The living room was dark, only a dim reading lamp aglow. She stood there for a long time, clutching her purse as if holding on to something that was no longer real. Then she moved to her bookshelf and pulled out an old, yellowed Bible. Between its fragile pages was a small, sealed bag of marijuana. No one expected someone like Cissy to hide that, but no one truly understood the agony of a mother forced to watch her child self-destruct day by day. She lit a cigarette slowly, not out of addiction, but as a quiet ritual. Then she poured a strong drink, drained it in one go, and sank into a chair, sighing as if all her strength had left. Smoke hung heavily, and through the haze she thought she saw Whitney once singing hymns with a crystal voice, face turned heavenward, eyes shining. She began to weep without sound. Only a single tear rolled down the face once proud as steel. No one knows exactly how that moment played out, but at dawn, Cissy remained seated with a hand resting on the open Bible at the verse, "Lord, please keep my child." Perhaps for the rest of her life. She prayed for nothing for herself, only that one day, Whitney's voice would return to the tomb clean, pure, and untainted by the clutches of addiction. Little Richard the Evangelist and his soul-torn turmoil. Once, Little Richard's voice shocked the world awake, in glittering suits, hair blazing skyward, and a scream like thunder. He wasn't just the king of rock and roll, he was its founder. White people imitated him, black people felt pride in him. Elvis Presley called him idol. James Brown quietly learned his dance moves, but amid the frantic applause and blinding lights, no one heard the sigh of a man wrestling with his own soul. Born in Macon, Georgia, in a devout Christian family, Richard knew early that he was different. He loved gospel but was intoxicated by stage glory. He preached in church by morning, then sang in nightclubs by evening. He vowed to God to give up rock, then signed another performance contract the next day. Each time he returned to church, he threw away straws and plastic wrap. Each comeback to the stage meant stuffing them into his jacket pocket with shaking hands. He once said he needed drugs to sing with that fire and dance like madness. Through nights that stretched into dawn, he'd sit alone after shows, wiping off messy makeup, pouring liquor into a small cross necklace as a warped act of penance. On April 16, 1977, after a lackluster show at an old Vegas hotel, Little Richard returned to his room in silence. He shut the door, removed his shoes, and kneeled on the bathroom floor as though praying. But instead of folding his hands, he pulled from his belt a bag of white powder and used a jar lid to line it up. No mirror, no music, no one there, just him, gasping breath, sweaty palms, and a wave of dizziness. When his manager found him, Richard lay motionless on the cold tile, clutching a battered Bible in one hand, the other pressed on a small radio playing Lucille on repeat. The room reeked of chemicals and cheap perfume. The yellow light cast his shadow as a blur beneath the empty bottle. He survived that night, but from then on, his voice no longer thundered. It grew raspy, sometimes cracking mid-song like a confession. And whenever he looked into the audience, his eyes seemed to wander. As if still searching for an answer he'd spent his life asking, would God hear a man like him when he sang? 18. Andraé Crouch, when praise became a burden. There was a time when every church in America resonated with Andraé Crouch's voice. He was the conductor of faith, the one who dared to take gospel beyond conventions, infusing it with soul, funk, and modern pop. He wrote for the Lord with notes that moved Michael Jackson, silenced Madonna, and brought congregations to tears. But that light wasn't enough to illuminate his own soul, where darkness had begun to seep in like a broken echo in a hymn. On May 13, 1982, at a quiet motel in San Fernando Valley, someone knocked on room 204 because of a strong chemical smell. When police entered, Andraé was sitting dazed in a chair, eyes red, in front of a glass plate stained with white powder and a half-written song lyric that read, "Where is the voice of God when I'm alone?" He gave a hoarse laugh, called it a friend's medicine, then fell silent when an officer pointed to a broken instrument lying in the corner. That afternoon, news of his arrest for drug possession swept through the faithful like lightning during a sermon. No one believed it, no one wanted to, but he, who once preached unshakable faith, admitted he was weaker than any of the lyrics he wrote. Behind his singing was a lonely man, turning to drugs as a way to numb the guilt of being exhausted from being God's man. 17. Helen Baylor, a prayerful voice in Lost Smoke. When Helen Baylor left Broadway to follow the Lord, many said she gave up glory for peace, but no one knew the stage lights had left a burn in her heart that could never heal. Helen had lit up New York music halls with her captivating voice. But behind the praise was a woman taking painkillers to sleep and waking to smoke marijuana to forget audiences who had turned away. On November 4, 1991, in a small apartment in South Central Los Angeles, Helen sat alone before a cracked mirror. Beside her was an empty bottle of sleeping pills and an old beer can from the night before. She had skipped a gospel recording session that afternoon, a session the producer had decades of hope for. She gave no explanation. She simply bowed her head and sighed. When church bells rang from afar, she looked in the mirror and saw herself singing in her childhood church. But that image quickly dissolved into the smoke she inhaled from her joint. Her eyes were red. Her hands trembled as she pressed the silent keys of her piano, as if begging God for forgiveness before drifting into a drugged sleep. Helen survived that dark chapter. But what remained was not just music, but a scar that would never heal, a scar of a woman who once sang for thousands in prayer, but every night cried in secret, praying she wouldn't give up. 16. Marvin Sapp, the 12-year-old boy and a lifelong confession. It's hard to believe that the man behind "Never Would Have Made It" a hymn that saved millions was once a 12-year-old boy sitting in a Grand Rapids, Michigan dump, tilting his head back to drink alcohol and holding white powder in his mouth, collapsing among empty cans like a discarded shell. It was July 11, 1979. His mother was working the night shift, and his father had been gone since he was 8. Marvin crept from the rundown house into a street corner where older kids gathered. They laughed, shared a white powder they called the key to forgetting. Marvin didn't know what to say. He just bowed his head and inhaled. Then, a second time, a third time, and by the 10th, no one could remember who offered it first. He grew up turning to alcohol or cocaine whenever he was hurt, even as he began singing and grew accustomed to applause. Marvin couldn't shake the emptiness of his childhood. Every time he stood at the pulpit, under the spotlight, he saw the 12-year-old boy in the trash, whispering a prayer no one heard. And that memory kept him standing. Not because he didn't hurt anymore, but because he knew his pain was real, and if God heard that boy, surely he would forgive the man he'd become. 15. Leandria Johnson, The Price of Victory. Some people win too early, before they've learned how to stand firm in fame. Leandria Johnson flared bright on Sunday best, yet the same glow nearly consumed her. Born in Orlando, Florida, in 1983 she grew up in a pastor's family, belonging to the church before she knew how to sing. After her 2010 win on Sunday Best, she was called Anointed Voice, and the media deemed her the revival face of gospel music. But behind the fame, she turned to substances to sleep, to perform, to survive. On August 22, 2012 at Atlanta Airport, she was found disoriented, staggering through the domestic terminal. She had just completed 3 straight nights of shows with little sleep and food, but she pushed through because they were waiting for me. She was taken to a private room where she burst into tears when asked, "Are you traveling with someone?" After that incident, she entered rehab and shared her story live, saying, "I sang with alcohol in me. I still sing, because I'm afraid if I don't, I'll die." Those words shook the community. Since then, Leandria has become more than a contest winner. She is a warrior with real battle scars. 14. Mahalia Jackson, Silence in the Spotlight. Mahalia Jackson was a voice that brought many to tears. But behind the singing was a life burdened with the pressure to always be seen as the gospel saint, a weight that fractured her heart day by day. Born in 1911 in New Orleans, Mahalia carried the deep undertones of the South woven with faith, pain, and hope. She was called the Queen of Gospel, trusted by Martin Luther King Jr., and even performed at his funeral. Yet few knew that off stage. She lived with chronic heart disease, severe arthritis, and pain she couldn't share. On July 4, 1967 at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, after performing for the Civil Rights Movement, Mahalia sat in room 203. Her feet were swollen, her pulse erratic. She opened a drawer and withdrew a bottle of strong painkillers, prescribed 1 pill by her doctor. But she took 3. That night, she wrote in her Bible in small letters, "If I can no longer sing, who will still need me?" 4 years later, in January 1972, Mahalia Jackson passed away in her sleep in Evergreen Park, Illinois. Her funeral lasted 4 hours, with over 6,000 in attendance. Still, people wondered who held Mahalia when she most needed companionship. 13. Jessie Dixon. The final applause no longer echoed. From European stages to church halls in Chicago, Jessie Dixon always knew how to lift audiences with his gospel voice and hands dancing over the piano keys. But the farther he traveled, the less he knew how to find his way back to himself. In 2001, Jessie's schedule was packed. 6 nights of performances in a single week, across 3 time zones, and every show demanded that he give his all. Then a former bandmate handed him a small bag. "This will help you get through the night." No one noticed the first time he used it, but afterward, it became routine. Methamphetamine didn't get him high, it gave him the stamina to sing 10 songs in a row without stopping. On June 12, 2005, at a hotel in Frankfurt, Germany, after performing the night before at an international gospel festival, he was found collapsed in his room, clutching a white nylon bag hidden inside a Bible. On the table were 3 half-drunk energy drinks. Doctors confirmed acute nervous exhaustion, severe dehydration, and signs of stimulant use. After that crisis, he canceled some tours, but the addiction returned quietly at times. In his final years, he still sang, but his eyes no longer sparkled. One assistant said, "He wasn't afraid of dying, he just feared nobody would remember how brilliantly he once lived." Jesse Dixon died in 2011 from cancer complications, but for many behind the scenes. His death began on that rainy night in Frankfurt when the applause could no longer keep him awake. 12. Shirley Caesar. The woman who always had a hidden bottle, Shirley Caesar was a fortress for over 6 decades. She didn't just sing, she touched souls. But when you are the rock for millions, who do you lean on? People knew her for her powerful hymns and dramatic spins on stage, but few noticed that backstage. She would quietly take a small glass bottle of honey-mixed liquor from her purse, what she called her throat medicine. In 1999, after the sudden death of her husband, Pastor Harold Durst Williams, Shirley became dependent on that medicine not just to protect her voice, but to hold back her pain. On February 20, 2003, as she prepared to perform at a memorial for her close friend gospel singer Dottie Peoples, she suddenly collapsed in her dressing room. Everyone assumed it was blood pressure related, but doctors found her blood alcohol level twice the legal limit. In her bag were 3 different sedatives, all prescribed by different doctors, unaware of each other's prescriptions. The incident was never made public. Her team said it was dehydration, but from that night on, Shirley never went on stage alone. A personal assistant always checked her bag and medications. She never spoke of it again, only sometimes stared into space and quietly said, "No one taught me how to endure being an icon." Shirley continued to live and sing, but her hidden bottle of liquor remained. 11. Dorothy Love Coates, the gospel prophetess and backstage fall. She was the prophetic voice of the civil rights movement, turning hymns into anthems. But behind that power, Dorothy Love Coates was a woman collapsing under sleeping pills and decades-long addiction. On March 12, 1965, after bringing thousands to tears with God's Got It in Montgomery, she returned to her dressing room and silently wept. Her hand trembled as she poured 4 barbiturates into her palm and swallowed them with a sip of liquor hidden in a tea thermos. It was no longer medication, it was her only escape from panic when the lights went down. Dorothy once said, "I sang as if God was calling me, but after every song, I felt like I died a little." The more she was praised as a messenger, the more isolated she became. At night, in a cheap boarding room, she smoked, drank, and prayed, hoping to wake up without needing pills. But dawn never changed. 10. Marianne Williams, a heavenly voice in unbearable pain. She was called God's gift, someone who could lift people to heaven with a high note. But nobody knew that to reach those heavenly notes. Marianne gradually gave her body to painkillers. On October 3, 1980, after a triumphant performance in Philadelphia, she collapsed backstage, clutching her throat, sobbing. Her vocal cords were torn, blood mixed with saliva. In her purse was a nearly empty bottle of Vicodin. "Without pills, I can't sing. Without singing, I have no one to live for," she whispered to her nurse. After leaving Clara Ward's group, Marianne lived alone, no children, no family, just a silent addiction growing with each tour. On stage, she stood like a goddess, but afterward she crawled across hotel floors looking for a lost half-pill. People saw her as the embodiment of faith, but she wrote in her diary, "If God truly sees me, why does he let me suffer like this?" Iny Purvis Staples, the overlooked voice and unheard plea. As the only son in the Staple Singers, Purvis always stood in the shadow of his father Roebuck and sister Mavis. But in that darkness, he turned to hard liquor and cannabis to remind himself, "I still exist." On October 17, 1974, after a civil rights concert in Chicago, he didn't return to the hotel with his family. Instead, he wandered into an old South Side bar, downed 3 bourbons, and smoked a hastily rolled joint. In his inebriated haze, he murmured to a stranger, "I sing with all my soul, but people only hear their voices." Purvis never sank into destructive addiction, but he used substances as a numbness balm. Later, he still sang and smiled on TV, but inside, the belief he was loved had been dead for a long time. 8. Billy Preston, the keyboardist torn between God and the devil. They called him the Fifth Beatle, the keyboard genius who lit up stages with George Harrison, the Rolling Stones, and Eric Clapton. But after every fiery performance, Billy Preston faced a cold room, a pipe, and white smoke that veiled his past. On January 15, 1984, after a tense recording session in Los Angeles, Billy returned to his small apartment, On the table, his mother's photo stood beside the electronic keyboard. He took a crack pipe from his pocket and lit it. In the smoke, he dreamed of his childhood church, but there was no God there, only his mother's scolding, beatings, and the small piano he played until his fingers bled. The more famous he became, the further he fell. He'd tried to quit after a near-fatal overdose, but the obsession wouldn't leave. "I don't know how to live without music, but I don't know how to live without drugs either," he said, waking in a hospital. All that remained after all his hits was loneliness, the one thing no hit could replace. 7. Inez Andrews, Heaven's Angel Trapped in a Gospel Gown. Inez's voice was described as a door to heaven, but that voice also pushed her into a labyrinth with no exit, where each high note cost her a night drowning in alcohol and sedatives. On July 20th, 1972, in Chicago, after a grueling Caravans performance, Inez returned to her hotel room to find news that her youngest daughter was hospitalized with pneumonia. She asked the manager about her cut pay and received a cold silence, in anger and helplessness. She opened the fridge, retrieved a hidden bourbon, and drank it down. Then she knelt in defeat on the floor and took 2 sleeping pills. They called her the Queen of Gospel, but no one asked how a queen survives when she can't afford to care for her child, when sorrow hides beneath makeup and a holy smile. That night, Inez did not die, but from then on, her voice gained a mournful layer no hymn could erase. 6. Joe Ligon, The Broken Giant in the Darkness. Some voices hit like fire, like a hammer striking the listener's heart, and Joe Ligon was one of them. On stage, he was an unwavering warrior, powering halls with soulful chants, but behind every performance, his body was worn out and spirit exhausted from the strain. On August 12, 1985, in New York, in a narrow dressing room reeking of sweat and disinfectant, Joe collapsed before the mirror. He couldn't breathe. The grueling tour schedule left him in a near-death stupor. His hand trembled into his jacket pocket where he kept a small bag of cocaine as a lifeline. Minutes later, he stood and roared on stage as if fatigue didn't exist, but only he knew his heart had been fractured long before. After that night, he admitted to a colleague, "I sing as if I've never truly lived as myself, and I don't know how many more nights I have left to keep pretending." 5. James L. Tyson, The Man Singing in the Basement of Memory. In every refined arrangement of the Swan Silvertones, James's warm bass anchored the music as a silent tether, yet the anchor itself went off course. No one saw him fall, because he fell quietly, regularly, and without a sound. On March 19, 1992, in a small Tennessee town, James awoke on a hotel room floor darkness. No one by his side, empty bottles of alcohol spilled, cannabis smoke lingered like slow-spreading ink. He opened his wallet and found a childhood photo of his mother under a pillow. He burst into tears, not from exhaustion, but fear he would die there unnoticed, fear he had betrayed the voice God gave him. He tore apart photos of the group kept as mementos. Then he knelt and prayed, "Lord, if you still hear me, bring me to a place where my voice is no longer drowned by the smell of alcohol." 4. Bobby Womack, A Lost Man Between Song and Ashes. Not everyone born in church finds their way back. Bobby Womack was considered a genius. He played guitar for Sam Cooke, wrote songs for the Rolling Stones, and had a voice that could burn emotions to ash. But fame couldn't heal a soul scarred too deeply. Family members died, marriages failed, and drugs were his refuge from unseen shadows. On January 2, 1989, alone in a Los Angeles ghetto park, he sat shivering on a bench, cold wind, empty stomach, hand clutching a fragment of a fix like a talisman, in a delirium. He saw his son appear silent, staring. That vision panicked him, and he clawed his own hand to wake himself, but there was no escape. Watching an ambulance driving down the alley, he whispered in despair, "I wish it was coming for me to take me where nobody asks who you used to be." 3. Reverend Timothy Wright, a pastor losing faith and drowning in sedatives after a crash. He was once called the pastor of song, a powerful baritone black minister leading thousands through church and studio music. Then tragedy struck on July 4, 2008, when the car he was driving was crashed head-on in Pennsylvania. The accident killed his wife and grandson instantly. Timothy survived with severe injuries and dozens of metal fragments in his spine. After a 9-hour surgery, He could no longer stand to preach. Doctors prescribed high-dose sedatives enough to let him sleep, but not cry. He became dependent. The more he took, the more detached he became from the hymns he once poured his life into. Prayer sessions grew shorter, and his eyes looked lost amid the community that once loved him. In early 2009, after internal complications, he was hospitalized and never regained consciousness in that silent white room. No prayers were sung, only a fading heartbeat, mirroring the faith he lost after the accident. 2. Willie Neal Johnson, the gospel king drunk in spirits and losing his voice. Willie was once the most vibrant spark of traditional gospel, capable of igniting a congregation with a soulful shout. But behind that voice was a heart drenched in alcohol. In the late 1990s, he was often seen backstage with a bottle in hand. Glazed eyes, sweat-moistened lips, every performance was a battle he drank to perform, then drank to forget he performed. The climax came on August 12, 2000 at a large church in Houston, while singing This Heart of Mine. He suddenly froze mid-line, face pale, hand shaking, his voice cracked, lost tempo, unable to sing a note. Hundreds of listeners stood in silence, unsure whether to pray or weep. He was escorted backstage, where he collapsed as always, but this time, he never rose again. Less than a year later, he died from cirrhosis, not from a single event, but from thousands of silent drops of alcohol slowly eroding his voice, turning a giant on stage into a mute shadow. 1. Thomas Whitfield, the arranging genius and silent death. Quiet and unassuming, Thomas was the invisible hand behind the rise of many gospel legends. They called him the Quincy Jones of the church, a musical genius with miraculous ears and a lonely soul. During the last decade of his life, he lived in studios, working almost non-stop, swallowing sleeping pills like candy just to sleep after each unfinished arrangement. Friends say Thomas always carried a bottle of pills not for pain, but because his mind never rested. On June 20, 1992, he entered a Detroit studio intending to record a demo, but come morning, his team found him slumped in a chair, lips purple, hands still on the keys, on the table. The sleeping pill bottle was empty, and the red recording light was still on. No suicide note, no cries of pain. He left as he lived quietly, immersed in music. But this time, the final dose extinguished every unfinished harmony in his mind forever. You might think gospel is where souls are healed, where light always triumphs over darkness. But today, you've read through 23 stories no Bible ever told where sacred voices fell to addiction, loneliness, and depression. They ignited thousands of hearts, yet couldn't keep themselves from the ashes of temptation. Which story haunts you the most? Share your thoughts below, because maybe a comment could be a prayer for those souls astray. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us as we reveal untold shadows behind legends of Black gospel.